Attorney of the Damned is the latest biography of Clarence Darrow, drawing on newly released letters and archive material. It's written by John Farrell, a senior writer at the Centre for Public Integrity and a former White House correspondent for the Boston Globe. And John Farrell joins us now from our Washington studio. John, thanks very much for talking to us.
Hey, and congratulations on a wonderful segment. I feel like I can just go home.
Why more than 70 years after his death does he have so much significance still?
I think because he was such a fighter for the common man. And in late 19th century America, early 20th century America, there were these huge oppressive forces beginning to weigh down on the little guy. First industry in the era, what we call the robber barons, and then the creation of the state, whether it was prohibition or the death penalty. And Darrow was just this champion for individual liberty, and that's why we remember him.
And it was the muckraking journalist Lincoln Steffens who came up with that title, the Attorney for the Damned. How did he earn that title? What did he do?
Well, he represented scores of people who had been condemned to death first off, and lost only one of them to the gallows. And that was the first one. So obviously he learned something from that one. But he also took cases like Leopold and Loeb that had symbolism throughout society, so that when he would speak, and when he spoke, he would speak for 3 days without notes, just fantastic feats of focus and concentration. But when he would speak, he would use these cases to make greater arguments about things like capital punishment or the rights of working men in American society.
Let's talk a little bit more about his ongoing campaign against capital punishment. You mentioned that he only ever lost one capital case, and he took over 100 capital cases. What kept him doing that? Because I imagine that would have been incredibly emotionally draining to keep going back and doing these capital cases.
Well, he was a very emotional man. People talk all the time about, he was a very flawed man, but he also had this great sense of compassion, and that was sort of the overriding theory in his chaotic personality. And so when confronted with some poor son of a gun who was left naked before the law, as he used to say, he just felt that he could not say no. Interestingly enough, he came from a very small town in the rural Midwest, and his father was a cabinet maker, which meant that he also was the town undertaker because he made the coffins. And so Darrow may have had a searing experience as a youth, confronted with death very early and constantly as a child, and perhaps that led to that revulsion for the death penalty that he carried throughout his life.
Darrow liked money and he liked a good time. Why did he not become a corporate lawyer? Why did he not live the high life and earn money off the big end of town?
As we like to say here, he spent all his money on wine, women, and song and wasted the rest of it. He was a corporate lawyer for a while. In Chicago, when he first arrived in Chicago, he worked for the railroads, which would be the equivalent of working for Wall Street these days. The railroads just dominated the American economy. And he gave it up. He walked away because he just felt guilty, because he looked out and he saw people being killed at railroad crossings. He saw the railroads beating up on their workers and banning them from joining in collective bargaining. And Darrow couldn't take it. He couldn't look himself in the mirror.
Let's talk more about the monkey trial, which featured in Hamish's story before, which happened in 1925 in Tennessee. And it was about the right to teach the theory of evolution in Tennessee schools. Tell us a bit more about the significance of that trial, because it was a huge drama in America at the time, wasn't it?
It was, and well, you in Australia know as well as we in America that World War I was this searing event, and nobody knew that the industrial warfare could lead to such carnage. And in America, one of the side effects or the repercussions was the development of what was called fundamentalism, which people felt that if they could go back to the simplicity of the Bible, to the good book, and to the stories of Genesis and the Old and New Testament, that things would be better, that they could get past this awful experience that they had and sort of push modernism away. And one of the ways they did it was they banned the teaching of evolution, the teaching of Darwin, in the public schools. And the American Civil Liberties Union, which was an organization dedicated to civil liberties, was looking around for a test case. And they found one in the little town of Dayton, Tennessee. And the prosecution lured a three-time American presidential candidate, William Jennings Bryan, to be a guest prosecutor. And as soon as Darrow heard that and saw the publicity possibilities, he entered the case on the side of the ACLU as the defense attorney. And of course, that wonderful clip of Spencer Tracy tells the whole story. Much of that speech is taken directly from Darrow's remarks in the courtroom.
And Bryan ended up being cross-examined by Darrow, and that was such a key moment in that case, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. The judge refused. He was the small-town judge, and he wanted to keep in step with his constituency. And he refused to let the defense put on scientific witnesses. And so without being able to prove their case that way, they turned to the only alternative that they had, which was to call William Jennings Bryan to the stand as an expert on religion and the Bible. And the courthouse was so crowded that they moved out to a platform out in the courtyard. And so the courthouse square, under the trees, and there took place what probably is the single greatest courtroom moment in American history, with Darrow cross-examining Bryan on questions of both science and religion, showing that Bryan was woefully ignorant about matters of science, and then somewhat unfairly and meanly asking Bryan things like, well, do you believe that God condemned the snake to crawling on its belly because of what happened in the Garden of Eden? And Bryan would say yes, and then Darrow would snicker and say, how do you think the snake got around before that? Do you think he hopped around on his tail? And the people in the courtyard would laugh, and Bryan would get angry and flustered, and it turned out to be a disaster for the prosecution. The other prosecutors would not let Bryan return to the stand the following morning.
And of course, this cross-examination was broadcast across the country on radio, and it made Darrow an even bigger star. And at the peak of his fame, the next case he took was really interesting, wasn't it? It said a lot about who he was.
It was. Maybe viewers in Australia remember this picture. We in the United States have it seared in our memory, of this racist group called the Ku Klux Klan marching down Pennsylvania Avenue with the Capitol Dome in the background, all of them in hoods and robes. And that was the 1925, and that was the year of the Scopes trial. So Darrow was at the peak of his fame, and American racism had reached a peak. And he could have gone, he needed money always, he could have gone to Wall Street, he could have gone back to Chicago and represented a rich divorcee. But instead he chose to go to Detroit, where an African-American family had been surrounded in their house by a mob, a racist mob that was throwing stones and breaking windows, and in self-defense the African-Americans had fired out of the window and killed a man. And they were all arrested and charged with murder. And so Darrow went to Detroit at the peak of his fame, peak of his earning power. He was 68 years old. He needed money for retirement, and for $5,000 represented these black Americans in two trials. The first trial ended up as a hung jury, and then the second trial he finally won the not guilty verdict that nobody thought that he could get, not even the NAACP. They were counting on him, losing and winning the case before the Supreme Court on appeal.
And what implications did that case have? Because we're talking about the 1920s here, 40 years before the Civil Rights Movement. What implications did it have for African Americans?
Yeah, believe it or not, it helped establish the principle that an African American man has the same rights of self-defense as a white man.
And Darrow was no angel himself, was he? And you write about this in the book, about bribery allegations, and that he basically paid juries, or arranged to have juries paid.
Well, both sides did, is the first thing to be said. It was a very rough time, and there are plenty of instances in history where robber barons, like the man who ran the transit firms in Chicago, were quite frank about telling reporters years later that they just bought juries. So it was something that was done on both sides. It's certainly not something to admire him for, and of course he got caught in Los Angeles in 1910 and put on trial himself. And so one of his greatest performances in the courtroom was on his own behalf in 1911, winning a not guilty verdict, although in the book I come to the conclusion that he probably did participate in a conspiracy to bribe jurors. It was a famous labor case, and his heart was in it, and I think he went too far.
And how did he morally justify that, given that he was considered a man of principle?
His moral justification for most things was that motive ruled. He argued very famously in the case of Eugene Debs and the American Railway Union before the Supreme Court that if 150,000 Americans go out on strike, that is morally correct. You can't argue with the needs of 150,000 people, even if the legislature has passed a piece of paper saying that they can't do that, and even if the judges issue an injunction telling them that they have to stop. So he just believed that the motive of a human being under the pressures that we are and the way that society forms us was much better judged than the dry scales of the law.
John, if Clarence Darrow was around today and practicing law, what kind of cases would he be taking on, do you think?
I think he'd be taking on the death penalty cases in the United States. I'm almost sure of it. And people ask me from time to time, who are the Clarence Darrows of our era? And while there's nobody that flamboyant, the capital punishment defense in the United States, the lawyers who participate are really unsung heroes. They do it for no money. They get very little respect in society, and they go in knowing that probably they're going to lose and probably it's just going to wrench the heart right out of them, and yet they do it anyway.
So he'd be fighting the same fights against the death penalty in favour of scientific, rational thought?
Oh, just the other day, Michelle Bachmann, one of the Republican candidates for presidency here, suggested that we go back to teaching creationism in the public schools. Yeah.
John Farrell,
So
great to talk to you.
Things change and they don't change.
John, thanks for talking to us tonight on Lateline.
Thank you very much for having me.